How many labels and titles did you come up with on the last exercise? 10, 20, maybe more? And what labels and titles would others give you? You know, in this video, you're going to be discovering and understanding more about the patterns in your life, as well as the triggers that create specific responses and reactions, some of which may be useful and some that are not. Now, the other year, I had a fall and I experienced a really seriously bruised face, which no amount of concealer and makeup could hide. It also coincided with a conference I was attending. And while I'd often forget about my appearance as I immersed myself in the engaging presentations during the conference, it was the looks from others that would often draw me back to the fact that I must have looked like I'd been in a car crash or been beaten up badly. And it's often the reflection in the mirror of others and the reflection of your memories that gives you your sense of I-ness. When you lock into your specific identity, it also locks you into certain patterns of behavior and being. And it's your patterns in thinking and behavior that create your response to circumstances and not the circumstances themselves. Think of it like driving a car. You first check that the gear is in neutral, and then you turn the key in the ignition, and of course that's how you drive a car. If you want to grow flowers in your garden, you need to prepare the ground first and then plant the seeds. Or if you want to call a friend, you need to dial the telephone number in exactly the right sequence in order to connect. And if you've invited friends round for dinner to produce a gourmet meal, you'll need to buy the ingredients first and then follow each step of the recipe in the correct order. Patterns are everywhere. In fact, you have a pattern for being you. And once you can begin to recognize those patterns, you can let go of old patterns that no longer serve you or get you the results that you want. And it's interesting to make a note of what you do every single day and notice the repetition and patterns as well as the results reflected in your life. So I highly recommend you buy a little notebook and keep a diary for the next few weeks to start recognizing those patterns. Now, I'm sure you know that if you want to be healthy, it's about eating the right food and exercising regularly. I mean, come on, that's not rocket science. Somehow, it's still easy to get sidetracked by the pizza, the burger and chips, isn't it? Now, that's a pattern of thinking and behavior that would be useful to unlearn, particularly if you want to be healthy. If you're creating the same reality every day, maybe the patterns for living your life need to change. Think of it like heading off for a beach holiday, yet your suitcase is still filled with hiking boots and jumpers from your last trip. Or maybe having a map of London when you're going to Timbuktu. So let's dig a little bit deeper into how patterns get set. In 1902, Dr. Edwin B. Twittmeyer, isn't that a wonderful name? Dr. Twittmeyer submitted a paper to the American Medical Association called Stimulus Response. And in that paper, it outlined the hammer-to-knee reflex. And you probably know that when someone taps you gently on the knee with a hammer, then you get a reflex action and your leg kicks up in the air. Now, what Twittmeyer realized was that if he went to tap someone on the knee, even if he didn't actually touch them on the knee, he'd still get the knee-jerk reaction. There was an expectation which created a response, and this is what he wrote about and published. Now, the American Medical Association, they weren't very interested and they failed to see its relevance at that time. Dr. Twittmeyer's paper was picked up by a Russian called Ivan P. Pavlov, who thought there was something interesting in this, and he started experimenting initially with dogs. So what he would do is he'd put some steak in front of the dogs, and when the dogs started salivating, he'd ring a bell. So he did this again and again and again. Every time the dogs were hungry, he'd put some steak in front of them, they'd start salivating, and he'd ring a bell. Now, he did this so many times that he found that just ringing the bell would make the dog salivate, even though there was no steak there. And in his research, he associated the sound of the bell to when the dogs were hungry and would salivate. So in 1936, after years of research with dogs, he submitted a paper to the Russian Medical Society called Conditioned Reflexes. Now, how does this relate to you? Well, as a human being, you are literally a conditioned response machine. Just for a moment, consider some of your conditioned responses today. Now, if you've been driving, then a red traffic light is the trigger that creates the stop response. If your stomach rumbles, then that's the trigger that you want something to eat. Or if the alarm clock rings in the morning, that's the trigger that creates the response of either getting up or maybe hitting the snooze button and rolling over for a few more minutes. Now, what about conditioned response in business? Well, just think when you call a meeting in business, that's the trigger. What response does that elicit? Is it great, an opportunity to share my creative ideas, or oh no, not another meeting? And you yourself are a trigger that creates a response from others when they hear your name, or when they hear your voice, or when they see you. So if you're the trigger, what's the response that you get from others? Is it, oh, or is it, oh no? And more importantly, what response would you like you, your name, the way you look, the sound of your voice, what response would you like it to elicit in other people? Conditioned responses can occur or be created in any of the 5 senses. For example, anytime I smell freshly cut grass, I'm transported back to memories of my father mowing the lawn when I was a child. And for you, it may be the smell of freshly brewed coffee or freshly baked bread that creates an instant response of pleasure. Perhaps somebody walks by you wearing a particular perfume or cologne that reminds you of a long-lost friend. Or maybe a particular song recreates memories of a great party or holiday. Now, as well as triggering positive memories, you've also unknowingly created negative responses to specific triggers. Perhaps a person looks at you in a particular way and you feel nervous, or your partner leaves the top off the toothpaste again and you get angry. In fact, whenever you respond without thinking, you're probably under the influence of a conditioned response, which makes them a very powerful force in your life because they build your habits. Research indicates that maybe 40 to 45% of what you do every day is actually a habit. You may feel like you're taking action and making decisions when actually the action and decisions you make stem from your habits. While they help you learn to become really good in certain areas, so for example, you don't have to think about stopping for a red traffic light because the red traffic light is the trigger for stopping and you do it automatically. They can, though, hold you in a pattern of less than useful responses and reactions as well. For example, perhaps you reach for the biscuit tin when you're stressed. And I actually know many people reach for something sweet when they're anxious rather than a healthy apple or a plate of kale. Could it be that many of us were given sweets and chocolate when we were upset as children, thus creating a habit of reaching for sugar when we're stressed now? So that's another example of a conditioned response. Now, as it's a learned association, that means you can begin to create more useful conditioned responses and release the triggers that no longer serve you. In fact, many phobias begin after a person has had a negative experience. So, for example, maybe after witnessing a terrible boating accident, a person might develop a fear of the sea. So that's an example of a negative conditioned response. So who and what pushes your buttons? Maybe somebody looks at you in a particular way and you bite your nails. Or perhaps you get really anxious when you're about to do a presentation in front of a peer group. So what I want you to do is to start paying attention to your responses, because guess what? It is possible to change a conditioned response.